In part 1, we saw how the father of Ernst Lerch had a café in the centre of Klagenfurt called the Café Lerch. This café became a place where local Nazis would meet, even though the party was banned in Austria. Many of these Nazis, 10 years later, would be committing acts of genocide. Prominent among them was Odilo Globocnik, Franz Kutschera, Friedrich Rainer, Hubert Klausner, Helmut Ortwin Pohl, Hans Albin Rauter, Sigbert Ramsauer, Reinholdt von Mohrenschildt, and Herman Hoefle, probably amongst others. Following the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany, Lerch got a job with the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, with a break to serve in the army during the Polish campaign. Probably at Globocnik's request, he was posted to Lublin in the summer of 1940, where he assisted in the initial persecution of the Jews there. He was posted to Kraków and then sent back to Lublin, where he was a major participant in the organisation of Operation Reinhard, the murder of the Jewish population of the General Government of Poland. He is therefore directly responsible for the joint murder of between 1.6 and 2 million people. As with many of the Operation Reinhard staff, he was sent to the Adriatic Littoral Operations Zone in the autumn of 1943, and there he took part in murdering Jews and fighting partisans. As the war drew to a close and British and American forces advanced north in Italy, he fled north. Of course, the roads then looked a bit different, but they were more or less in the same place as they are now, and of course the scenery is almost exactly the same. This is what it looks like. On the 6th of May 1945, the higher SS and police leadership of the Adriatic coast zone was in Moggio in northern Italy, located right next to the Austrian border. On that day, Globocnik went to Herman in Austria, where he was seen by Georg Michelsen. Michelsen had been one of the criminals with Lerch and Globocnik involved in Operation Reinhard. Globocnik went back to Moggio, where he met with SS Brigadeführer Heinz Hamel. In the previous months, Hamel had taken part in the battles of Arnhem, Alsace, Pomerania, and on the Oder and Neisse rivers. His troops had been encircled near Spremberg to the south of Berlin. On the 22nd of April 1945 they broke out, but with heavy losses, and a few days later Hamel was relieved of his post at the instigation of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, and at this late stage of the war was given the command of the SS Junker School in Klagenfurt. There he formed a combat zone on his own initiative, with which he successfully kept the nearby Alpine passes open for retreating German troops. Clearly the meeting with Globocnik was to find out which passes were open for his men to cross. It was decided that the following day they would move the higher SS and police leadership of the Adriatic coast onto Hermagor. Hamel surrendered to the British on the 8th of May 1945 at Rosenthal near Villach. Meanwhile, on the 7th of May 1945, Lerch and Michelsen made their way by vehicle to Neusack on the northern shore of Lake Weissensee. They were accompanied by SS Sturmbannführer Hermann Hoefle and SS Oberscharführer Hellitzberger. I don't know anything about Hellitzberger, but I have prepared videos on both Michelsen and Hoefle. The Hotel Enzien is still in business in Neusack. It's been in business since 1926 and it is still owned by the same family, now in the 4th generation. It was there in 1945. I presume the owners were not too pleased to see SS men turn up and were no doubt very pleased to see the back of them once they left. The SS men passed by and left some of their weapons here, others they threw into the Weissensee. At Neusack there was a food dump which had been handed over to the Bürgermeister for distribution to the locals. Some of this food was taken by the fleeing SS men who now headed east along the banks of the Weissensee and then up a steep mountain trap to the Moslacher Alm, where they knew of a mountain hut in which they could hide. On the way up the mountain, they encountered a group of men from the Brandenburg Division, commandos who were used for special operations, often behind enemy lines. There were around 80 to 100 of them. Lerch later said that he believed that they intended to cross the River Drau to the northeast in small groups and then make their way to the Tyrol. Lerch's group, however, was going to stay. At a height of 1,250 metres, the mountain must have appeared to offer a very good place to hide out until such time as the situation quietened down. On the 10th of May 1945, two female employees of the higher SS and police leadership, Espenheim and Ziranka, joined the men who were hiding. On the 13th of May 1945, SS Oberscharführer Kummerer arrived. He asked for shelter, but this was denied owing to a lack of food. He was advised to seek shelter at a farm. This proved to be a costly mistake for those who denied him shelter. Possibly realising that the food situation was not good, Lerch wrote a letter to the British military authorities in Hermagor. He proposed a meeting in order to negotiate a surrender of the party. He left the letter with a peasant in Boden, some 3 kilometres from the hiding place, with the request that he pass it on to the British. Over the next few days, more stragglers, mainly soldiers, passed them. Food and shelter were requested but refused. On the 19th of May 1945, Lerch went out for a walk and came across Gauleiter Rainer. This was, or so Lerch claimed, entirely coincidental, and he had no idea that Rainer was in the area. They had a quick chat and Rainer ordered him to return to the others, but they agreed to meet again 10 days later. For security, they agreed on a whistle signal. How things had changed. Only a few years earlier, Rainer and Globocnik had been called to see Hitler and promised that one day Austria would be part of the Reich. They had got that Reich which had allowed them to follow their dream of murdering all the Jews in Europe. And now they were hiding once again, as once they had hidden from the Austrian authorities. On the 20th of May 1945, Globocnik arrived at the hiding place. He was ill and exhausted. For the next few days, he remained in bed. On the 29th of May 1945, Lerch made another attempt to pass a letter to the British. He went to Boden and heard there that a Dr. Eichinger from Villach, together with a timber merchant from Spittal named Haslacker, together with a British officer, were looking for Rainer. Dr. Eichinger was possibly Sturmbannführer Ewald Eichinger. From here, Lerch made his way to the rendezvous point where he had previously agreed to meet Rainer. After a quick discussion, Rainer agreed to come to the Moslacker Alm to discuss the situation with Globocnik the following day. At this meeting, Rainer and Globocnik decided that the best course of action was to give themselves up. How can this be explained? It appears that they were terrified of being captured by the Yugoslavian partisans. Therefore, a peaceful surrender to the British made sense. They agreed to hand themselves in voluntarily, but events overtook them. As British forces moved into Austria and an area sometimes referred to as the Alpine Redoubt, there was a fear of werewolf activity. As US General Walter Bedell Smith said, "We had every reason to believe that the Nazis intended to make their last stand among the crags." This fear was shown to be real when Ernst Kaltenbrunner was arrested. Under interrogation in London, he openly spoke of setting up a Nazi terrorist organisation to continue fighting. This fear was backed up by Ernst Lerch. He stated that in December 1944, Gauleiter Rainer received instructions to set up a werewolf organisation in Carinthia. Lerch said that Rainer could not see the point, but nevertheless he obeyed the order. Both Lerch and Michelson stated that as far as they were aware, no plans were made. Of course, they had not had contact with Globocnik between the 6th and 20th of May 1945, and he didn't talk about what he'd done, but when he was with them, he said that any resistance was futile. The Allies were looking not only for signs of resistance from werewolves, but also for suspected Nazi war criminals. Top of their list was Gauleiter Friedrich Rainer and SS General Odilo Globocnik. Lieutenant Ken Headley was a British officer. He later told a researcher, "I was driving my jeep up a mountain road when suddenly I saw a Wehrmacht major in full uniform standing in the road. I had my pistol out as quick as a flash, but no, he said, you don't need that, we're on your side now." Turned out to be a thoroughly decent fellow, a major in the Brandenburgers. Very good chaps. The Brandenburgers, an Abwehr special regiment similar to the Commandos, had already reported to British intelligence at Spittal that they had heard that the British were looking for the Gauleiter and SS people and volunteered their help. And they delivered. The little jailhouse in the castle grounds in Spittal was soon occupied by a string of SS men picked up in the mountains. On the evening of 30th of May 1945, the Hussars, and I now quote, had discovered a rich liquor cache and they were throwing a little party in the castle. The festivities were well underway when the NCO in charge of the lockup marched in and whispered to Headley that one of the prisoners wanted to make a statement. Headley went along with two fellow officers. One of them, Major Alex Ramsey of Special Forces, spoke several languages. The two of them were witnesses. The young sergeant was from an SS mountain unit, Headley said, and he told us he'd been taking food up to a very special group hiding in the mountain. General Globocnik was there with his staff, he said, and he could lead us up there. According to the war diary of the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, on the evening of the 29th of May 1945, two SS men named Siegfried Kummerer and Schutz were captured at Stockenboy. Stockenboy is located approximately 4 kilometers from the eastern end of Weissensee. Kummerer was interrogated the next day and he said that 5 SS men and 2 women were hiding in a hut on the Moslacher Alm. At 2200 hours on the 30th of May 1945, 5 officers and 12 men from the 4th Queen's Own Hussars left Partignon and arrived at the mountain at around 0230. For the next 2 hours, they walked to the hut and arrived there at around 0430. They surrounded it. Later, under interrogation, the Nazis claimed that they took it in turns to do guard duty that night. Ernst Lerch had the first watch, Mikkelsen the second, and Hoefle the third. At 0510, the Queen's Own Hussars men made a forced entry into the hut and arrested 8 men and 2 women. All the arrested persons were brought down to Partignon. The 8 men arrested at Mosbacher Alm were later shown to be Gauleiter Dr. Friedrich Rainer, SS Gruppenführer Globocnik, SS Sturmbannführer Mikkelsen, SS Sturmbannführer Ernst Lerch, SS Sturmbannführer Herman Hoefle, Kreisleiter and Gaurichter Hugo Herzog, and Kreispropagandleiter Plob. The 2 women weren't named in the report, but they were arrested. They were all captured and taken to the chateau in Partignon, some 10 kilometers to the east in the direction of Villach. On arrival, they were offered coffee, but Globocnik refused. Siegfried Kummerer warned the British that the man was Globocnik at around 11:30. In order to get proof, a trap was arranged. Whilst the British officer casually conversed with him, another British officer, Major Ramsey, shouted, "Globocnik!" in parade ground tones from a balcony. Seeing a reaction from Globocnik, Lieutenant Headley moved towards him and took him away. Globocnik, protesting his innocence, was led away through a small archway and towards a lockup. After around 150 meters, he hit his jaw with his hand, causing the glass vial secret in his mouth to break. He collapsed immediately and died within a couple of minutes. Around midday, his body was identified by Hermann Hoefle, Karl Hellersberger and Georg Mikkelsen. This photograph possibly shows the dead body of Globocnik. Standing next to him is Hermann Hoefle, behind him is Lerch and Mikkelsen. Lerch claimed that he watched the death of Globocnik from his cell window. He saw him bite on the pill, fall down, turn blue and die immediately. This must have taken some doing, as Lerch did not have a cell window, and apart from that, Globocnik didn't turn blue and he didn't die immediately. An attempt was made to revive Globocnik using injections, but it failed. The other prisoners were called out and given a body search after the dead man was identified. Hoefle and Lerch both had poison capsules on them. This is Wolfsberg, Austria, located approximately halfway between Klagenfurt and Graz. Lerch was brought here for interrogation. Lerch admitted to his British captors that he had fought in the Polish campaign, but he said that he was then discharged from the army and he went to work assisting hotel proprietors who had moved from the South Tyrol, which was in Italy, to Carinthia, which was then part of the German Reich. South Tyrol had been part of Austria before the First World War and even today has a German-speaking majority in many places. Lerch said that he'd been then deployed to Kraków before being sent to the Adriatic Military Operations Zone. He claimed that he did not meet Globocnik until September 1943, which was in fact the very time that he was travelling with him to Trieste. Here, he said, he was working with Cossacks and other Russian collaborators. As far as the Holocaust was concerned, he denied everything, and this was to be his line of defence to the very end. As far as he was concerned, he'd never been to Lublin. He knew nothing. Surely this must be a case of mistaken identity. The British were not well prepared, and it would seem that Lerch was particularly good at being a subject of interrogation. He had not been in the Gestapo, where he might have learnt a few tricks. However, the British did not know much about what had happened in Poland. One might have thought that the mention of Kraków might have rung alarm bells. Then again, perhaps they didn't know what happened there. Lerch later managed to escape. He then disappeared, possibly to Italy from 1947 to 1950. Thinking everything was now safe for him, and still aged only 35, he returned to Klagenfurt to his family. He took over the family business and he gave it a new look. It became a modern look for the 1950s, a dance café, and he was able to hire acts like Udo Jürgens. Here we see in this photograph the future Eurovision Song Contest winner with the mass murderer from Lublin. Lerch was arrested again in 1960, put on trial in Germany and sentenced to 2 years in prison by the Wiesbaden Regional Court. Its case number HJS 1145 from 1960. The sentence was deferred because of his internment by British authorities after the war. In 1971, Vienna-based Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal approached the Austrian authorities about Lerch. Legally, Lerch was a remote accessory to murder in the opinion of the Austrian Justice Ministry. However, this line of thinking was proved erroneous. Max Czechotsky, born near Bydgoszcz in 1916, had been used by Globocnik as a translator as he spoke Polish and sometimes as a driver. He'd also helped Globocnik store the stolen property of the victims for his own personal use. He clearly knew Globocnik well and was trusted by him. Czechotsky knew what was going on. He stated that Lerch was Globocnik's number 2. Then Herman Vortov, who had been head of the Gestapo and senior police leader in Lublin, stated at his trial that Lerch had been very active during the liquidation of the ghetto in Maidan Tatarski and having the population murdered in the Krempice forest near Lublin in November 1942. Herman Vortov was deeply implicated in the Holocaust. He was born on the 23rd of March 1910 in Bergisch Gladbach. He was posted to Lublin in the spring of 1941 and assigned to the commander of the security police and the SD in Lublin. In this role, he assisted in the deportation of the inhabitants of the Lublin ghetto to the death camp at Bełżec. He was one of those sent to Warsaw under the command of Herman Hoefle to arrange for the deportation of the Jews there to Treblinka. Adam Cherniakow, leader of the Warsaw Judenrat, referred to Vortov in his diary. He wrote that Vortov had been in his office with others and demanded a transportation of children. On the day that he committed suicide in order not to have to participate in organising this deportation to death, Adam Cherniakow wrote that once more Vortov had been in his office to discuss a variety of questions. Back in Lublin, at the Maidan Tatarski ghetto on the 9th of November 1942, Vortov was involved in the selection of victims, and in one case, he himself led the firing squad. On the 16th of December 1975, Vortov was sentenced by the Wiesbaden Regional Court to a total of 8 years in prison. He died on the 28th of March 1982. Ernst Lerch was tried again, this time in his hometown of Klagenfurt, together with Helmut Pohl. Pohl had been an assistant of Globocnik in Lublin. The Vienna Public Prosecutor's Office charged him with crimes of mass destruction because of his participation in the murder of 1.8 million Jews in eastern Poland during Operation Reinhard, as well as other violent crimes. Despite this extremely serious charge, the main hearing was discontinued in May 1972 after only 2 days of proceedings at the request of the public prosecutor, and it was never resumed. The case reference number is 25 VR 3123 of 1971. Nonetheless, by now the publicity was such that Lerch had to give up running the family café. Being a mass murderer mightn't have bothered the Austrian legal system too much, but it probably put off the clients. One can imagine the frustration of people like Simon Wiesenthal. The Austrian authorities had enough on many people to put them away forever, and top of that list should have been Ernst Lerch. The Israelis weren't impressed either. According to the memoirs of former Mossad agent Yossi Chen, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Agency planned to kill Lerch. Menachem Begin gave his assent to such a hit in 1977. The plan was to use a bomb to do so. However, the plan was dropped for the obvious reason that such an act would damage relations between Israel and Austria, and there was always the risk that an innocent person could be hurt. So that form of justice was denied too. Paul Globocnik is the son of Odilo Globocnik. He was born in 1946 after the death of his father. He attempted to speak to Lerch about his father, but Lerch always refused to meet him. His mother died in 1977, so Lerch was possibly the only person that would have had information on his father. I presume that Lerch refused to see Paul Globocnik, as the latter may have had too many probing questions to ask about what had happened during Operation Reinhard. However, Lerch did give interviews to other people. He spoke to Gitta Sereni about the death of Globocnik, which he claimed to have witnessed, as described earlier, something refuted by then Lieutenant and later Major Headley. Ernst Lerch lived out the rest of his life in peace. Large parts of his CV are missing, as is the final part. There's doubt on his date of death. 2 dates are given and they're 5 years apart. The date of his death is often given as 1992. As far as I can tell, he died in 1997. There are 2 final points I'd like to make. The first concerns the attitude of Austria. On this channel, I've frequently spoken about the lack of post-war justice in Germany, which suddenly, after unification in 1989, did a complete turnaround. That was how major mass murdering criminals could get away with it and have successful careers in, above all, the justice system after the war. Then, after unification, the German government spent years tracking down and prosecuting minor figures who probably had no influence whatsoever on the crimes being committed. In 2004, Ephraim Suvov, director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center office in Jerusalem, said to a group I was in Warsaw that the country which was then the keenest on hunting down Nazi war criminals was Germany. However, neither Austria nor Italy showed any interest in pursuing criminals, including into the 1990s. In 2012, a Graziani museum was opened in Italy using public funds, which apparently celebrates the life of this mass killer and war criminal. However, the worst offender of all is Russia. Not a single person was ever prosecuted for crimes such as the Katyn massacre or any of the other killings committed in Stalinist times. Indeed, the criminals of the Stalinist regime are today treated as heroes, whilst their victims remain that, just victims, and those that try to investigate, report, or even publicly remember these crimes are themselves the subject of prosecution. The case of Ernst Lerch is perhaps so bad because he openly lived in Klagenfurt with a high-profile dance cafe, despite being directly responsible for the organisation of Operation Reinhard. The second point relates to the death of Odilo Globocnik. There are major problems with the eyewitness evidence and there are contradictions. For example, Lieutenant Headley, later Major Headley, said that Globocnik was wearing a blue suit and the man in the photograph does not appear to be wearing a blue suit. Could it be that Kammerer gave away someone else in order to protect his former boss, and that the story of him being denied food and shelter on the Mossbacher Alm is just a cover? There were stories floating around relating to Globocnik's survival in the 1990s. Gitta Sereni investigated it, for example. Whereas I accept that major criminals such as Hans Kammler may have been taken by the United States authorities as they had something to offer, indeed Herbert Langer, the man who first used a homicidal gas van, possibly was also picked up by them. There's also evidence concerning the survival, albeit temporary, of Friedrich Rainer, which I shall deal with in another video. However, I failed to see what Globocnik had to offer the Allies, and he was well enough known to be on an Allied wanted list. He was too high profile to be spirited away. I've looked into the conspiracy theories about the death of Globocnik, and all I can say is that these theories are more convoluted and contradictory than the story of his death. In any case, despite their long friendship, I'm sure that Lerch was glad that Globocnik was dead, as now he couldn't testify against him. There was a risk that Lerch might have been handed over to the Soviet Union, Poland or Yugoslavia, and in each case his end would have been at the end of a rope. I think I'll leave the final word about this to someone who knows more about this than I do. I would like to read you a piece from Joseph Popczeczny's book Odilo Globocnik, Hitler's Man in the East, which incidentally is one of the best books on Operation Reinhard. Lerch, the convivial and diplomatic eminence grise, may have developed influential contacts in post-war Austria, allowing him to block any attempt to bring him to the book, even when at the wire. As late as 1997, the year he died, two researchers said of him and his two even more sinister Austrian colleagues, Odilo Globocnik and Herman Hoefle, the leaders of the Action Reinhard, were responsible for the killing of 1.8 million Jews in death camps in eastern Poland in 1942 and 1943. The two researchers went on to highlight the vast disparity between the way war criminals were treated in West Germany and Austria. In the former, a series of well-publicized trials were witnessed during the 1960s and 1970s, whereas in Austria, the past has been dealt with only by a very small circle of critical researchers. Turning again to the quite obvious, influential Klagenfurt café proprietor, they wrote, "In Austria, however, there was no large trial at that time. Of the few proceedings that took place, some ended with incomprehensible acquittals. 2 days into the trial, the prosecuting attorney dropped the charges against Ernst Lerch. Lerch was Odilo Globocnik adjutant at the time of the Action Reinhard mass murders. He was also responsible for the killings of hundreds of partisans in and near Trieste." One of the incomprehensible acquittals was the Lerch trial, and until the relevant documents, which are probably held in certain Austrian party political, legal and perhaps police archives, are accessed and objectively analysed, all that can be said with any degree of certainty is that Lerch was one of the 20th century's most destructive behind-the-scenes operatives. His skills appear to have been revived after the war. After bluffing his way past skilled British military interrogation, he went to his death in 1997 without ever having to pay the ultimate price for his enormous genocidal Lublin crimes. Notwithstanding this, the British held him for some time in Wolfsburg, from where he escaped and hid out between 1947 and 1950, after which he was able to arrange being denazified. But it appears he was sentenced to a 2-year term that was deferred because of his Wolfsburg internment. Lerch, a shadowy character to say the least, certainly deserves far greater study and analysis, and such investigations could well reveal that he might have been an even more significant person in Lublin than Globocnik or Wirth as a behind-the-scenes planner and coordinator. I started writing this in March and now it's the beginning of December, so it's taken me a long time to do. I hope you found it interesting. I'm sure I'll be updating it in the future. I'd like to go to the Mosbacher Alm and to investigate this myself, to look at the scenery, see how it was. I don't suppose I'll come up with any new evidence. I'm pretty certain I won't come up with any new evidence, but just to be there would be nice. I spend a lot of time travelling around to do these videos, and so that's why you can often see what places look like today in them. You might like to subscribe. I upload every Tuesday and every Friday at 2000 hours my time, so it's Central European time. Now you might like to see videos I did on Hubert Klausner, who was the first commandant at the Kulmhof death camp.